Yeah.
I mean, I understand it now, but I'm like, not actually where my interest lies.
Okay. I just didn't know if they were gonna.
We need to run off some. Other questions and others?
Really, just having full. Hello.
Here it is. Somebody else gives it to us.
Yours is.
Full voice.
Is mine? Oh, it is.
Mine is.
All right. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. This is Connecting with Your Community Through Comics. So if you're here, you're likely a librarian, an educator, a parent, some kind of stakeholder in the world of literacy. If not, it's weird that you're here, but we're still glad to have you. I would like to start by having each of us introduce ourselves. I think what?
Okay.
We're going to go in the order of Betsy.
Gotcha. Oh,
Starting with
my
Betsy.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Betsy Gomez, and just wait for it. It's a really long title. I am the Assistant Director of Communications and Public Outreach for the Office for Intellectual Freedom at the American Library Association. Apparently we don't believe in short titles, but in that capacity, I'm the coordinator for Banned Books Week and the Banned Books Week Coalition. And I also coordinate Unite Against Book Bans, which is a public-facing campaign to facilitate direct action in communities where censorship is happening.
All right, that's a lot to follow. I'm Christina Taylor. I am the Youth Services Consultant at the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. So I'm presently at the State Library in Texas, but my background is rooted in K-12 education. And so I spent 14 years as a high school English teacher, and after that, 7 years as a school librarian.
My name is Jana Tropper. By day, I'm a speech and language pathologist in elementary school outside of Chicago. I work with a self-contained program that has typically neurodivergent students, and I work with them with their communication disorders and differences. By evening, weekend, and federal holiday, I write comics for Epic, including Animal Rescue Friends and Seeker Society. I'm also the Director of Literacy for Reading with Pictures, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to getting schools into comics and comics into schools.
Brief shout out to Reading with Pictures. It's how all three of us met.
Yes, we all met volunteering for that organization, which is always open to more volunteers. So please, readingwithpictures.org to check out. There's also lots of research and resources on that website if you are looking to elevate comics, sequential art, manga, graphic novels, any of that within an educational setting. So the topic of our discussion today, and I'm sure we'll go off topic because this is a small group and those always get exciting, is to talk about connecting with our communities through comics. So Dr. Rudane Bishop Sims introduced the literacy world to the concept of reading serving as windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. Furthermore, many have stressed that the ability to see oneself reflected back at them from the page is the most important function of all, especially for those who find themselves marginalized. That said, how do you use comics to reflect cultural heritage, address underrepresented topics, and in general elevate voices who are either silenced or pushed to the side in your community? Starting with Betsy.
Am I going to have to go first the whole time? I am, aren't I? So prior to working for the American Library Association, I worked for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, who I recommend you visit in the Convention Center, booth 1918. And I worked for CBLDF in some capacity for as a volunteer and a staff member for like 20 years. And so one of my purviews while I was with CBLDF was kind of public education and informing people about comics as a format and the risks that comics face. CBLDF was started as an organization to fight censorship when retailers were running afoul of obscenity laws in various locations. And over the years, it expanded into work in schools and libraries. And so I spent a lot of time working on projects dedicated to using comics as community builders. Handbooks about book clubs, materials that inform parents about comics and their benefits. It kind of culminated in a project called She Changed Comics. We talk about underrepresented groups, and, well, women have been an underrepresented group within comics for many decades. We've seen a lot of improvement in that regard, but we've also lost a lot of the history of how women have participated in comics and how they were formative from the start. Looking at women's magazines and the illustrations of Rose O'Neill and just, I could go on for hours. And so, with that project, we were informing people about women who'd done something substantive or been censored for their work. We also did a number of projects related to Black History Month, to Pride, focusing on creators and comics that tell the story of those communities and provide a perspective on the Black experience, on the LGBTQ experience. With the work I'm doing now at the ALA, we're actually doing a lot of work defending those communities because those communities are under direct attack in libraries. The majority of the work that's being censored these days is LGBTQ content, and we're seeing a lot of books by Black people, indigenous people, people of color. And so at this point in time, the work has shifted into defense and facilitating action to defend libraries and the communities that they serve.
Thank you, Betsy. So a through line in all of my responses as we talk is going to be kind of the concept of teaching a fan to fish. And so rather than giving you specifics, not just things that I've tried personally, but largely kind of the overlying strategy or underlying strategy, what underpins this work. And so my first thought is when you are looking to connect with members of your community, be strategic. Look at the demographic information for your library, for your classroom, for your on-campus curriculum, or just your curriculum in general. So look at those and look through the lens of who is not feeling connected in my community, who, if at school, who is not feeling a sense of success, who is not connecting and seeing themselves in your curriculum. If you're in a library, ask yourselves not necessarily just who comes to my library, but who doesn't. And thinking about once you have specific goals, specific populations that you're wanting to reach out to. Blast, my notes just went black, hang on. So once you have identified those groups of people that you want to focus on, like I said, start thinking about what would make them feel seen. Obviously, the best thing you could do, although it's not always practical, is ask. Ask, find out what makes you feel seen, and want to make sure that you are being featured in my curriculum or on my shelves, in my collection, in that way to help them get connected. Now, many times if people aren't walking through your door, high school, you don't quite have exactly that same scenario because I taught a course, core tested subject area. Everyone needed English to graduate. And so I kind of had a captive audience to some degree. They may walk into my door. It didn't mean they were being successful. And so finding out how to connect with those individuals. And then I lost my train of thought. Just so once you have identified them, oh yes, there we go. If the people aren't always in front of you, you may want to ask yourself, where are they going? They're going somewhere. And so thinking about places where they are, thinking of places that they may pay to attend, places they may play, as well as thinking about things like places where they find kind of mental and spiritual fulfillment. So thinking about where they play, pray, and pay. And how you can reach people. And sometimes that means bringing it to them. If you can't get them to walk through the door, where are they? And seeing if you can be in that space. Can you contribute to what's going on there? Maybe it's just a matter of you're being seen. You're there as a librarian in your community, and you've taken the time to attend their events where people are feeling valued. Sometimes it's a matter of, can I table? Can I talk? Can I do a story time? Can I do a read aloud? If you're targeting adults, can I do a reading? And just how you can help bring these literacy resources. Now, the other one I will say, in addition to being strategic, is intentionally normalize comics in those spaces. As a school librarian, when I was there, I walked into a collection that the only thing that represented comics were superhero comics and mangas. And I was the only librarian who even remotely read them. So thinking about every time I did displays, any time that I did reader advisory, any time that we had an event, or if we were, selling prom tickets and had a book display, always making sure that in addition to prose and whatever other format we had, I made sure that I slipped in some comics and graphic novels so that they just saw it. They saw it there. And then when I wanted to do more active programming with it, I always made sure I included that. And so, Jana?
It's fantastic. I forgot I was on the panel. It's like, I'm just taking notes over here. So in order of least captive audience to most captive audience, I work with elementary students who are very much not able to make the choices about where they are. They wind up on my caseload, on my roster, because that has been determined through standardized testing, through interview, that they have a communication disorder of some kind, or they have another neurodiversity or a condition that prevents their communication from being successful, and sometimes that's the environment, not so much the student. Nevertheless, I have the very definition of students whose voices are silenced, are quieted, are non-existent. I have several students who I'd say maybe half are non-speaking or partially speaking students. So in addition to the clinical component where we get assistive technology, we get other forms of communication, I always make sure that when I'm selecting comics, when I'm selecting picture books, that I am picking stories where it's not always the student with dialogue. The child doesn't always speak. They may participate in the story, they have agency for sure, but I'm making sure that they are represented in those stories, and when I share that with the families, I want the families to do it, to know that that their child is seen, that's seen by me, and that they are also seen by the world at large. A wonderful book that came out recently is called A Day with No Words by Tiffany Hammond. I see nods. Has anyone read this? It's written from the point of view of an autistic mother who has two autistic sons, one of whom is a non-speaker that uses a communication device, and it talks about their day with no words. And it is one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. The story itself is gorgeous. The art is phenomenal. It's a New York Times bestseller. It just sold out at Target, and I was so mad because I was trying to check out. It was just, anyway, you'll find it somewhere, but it is phenomenal. But it is something I use a lot with my students. And so I was holding the book up, and I was doing a read aloud toward the end of the school year. And in the story and in real life, this author is autistic and uses AAC as well as her son. So the mother has a communication device. So it's a software app where they push buttons, the buttons say words, that's how they communicate. And it had a bright green case. The one I use for modeling my students has a bright green case, and one of my non-speaking students was pointing at that, and I was just like, why are you pointing at me? And I had to take a step back, and so they saw something that they matched in their world. And it was just me. I wasn't even being represented in the way that we're talking about representation here. But our students that aren't speaking are listening. Just because you're not speaking doesn't mean your ears don't work just fine. The rest of your brain, all those other wirings aren't in place, that they're not recognizing it. So making sure that, especially when working with families, that you reassure them that you're seeing them. I also work in Aurora, which is a World Relief Hub. So when I say it's diverse, I'm not like, we have some black and brown kids. I mean, we've got people from all over the world who are typically here under incredibly stressful circumstances. So I've got students that speak Bengali, Nepali. We've got students that are Swahili. Like just everything. It's not just go on to Teachers Pay Teachers and find your Spanish version of whatever. I really have to do that. And what I've done when I've been differentiating materials is I will have with the interpreter, which by the way, by law must be provided by the school district in case anybody's in that situation where they're acting like they can. It may be over the phone, but they do have the right to that. I've had the parent help me construct basic communication boards saying, okay, this is the word for go. This is the symbol we're going to associate with go here. I'm going to write it in English. Can you write it in your home language or a version of that? And then we construct that together. Not only do they have the agency of participating in constructing it, but they're also in the moment telling me the things that are important. What do you play with? What do you pray about? What do you pay for? What are words we need on here? Those important cultural touchstones, they have the agency of being connected. I'm seeing them, and they're showing me. And I think that having the participation, when, again, I have the unique circumstance where my kids have to be there by law. Parents have to attend at least one IEP meeting a year, that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that they don't want agency, even if they seem disengaged, because it can be a true sense of learned helplessness, not because they don't want to try, but because they've tried so many times and failed, been pushed down, been ignored, met with violence, whether social, physical, verbal, that it's not worth trying anymore. And I'm trying to show them it is worth trying anymore by giving them that agency.
Question?
Yes. So on to the next question. How do you use comics to leverage community initiatives and strengthen connections?
Okay.
Betsy.
The work that I'm doing now is community organizing. I'm helping individuals in various communities around the country who are encountering censorship. And so one of the things I often talk to them about is finding innovative ways to engage their communities. Not just showing up at public comments, but also finding ways to engage beyond, just the meetings and the protests. Because part of community organizing and maintaining interest in protesting issues within the community is maintaining interest within the group you're working with. And so coming up with creative ways to develop connections within the community that you're working with to fight censorship and to fight the issues that you're facing. And it often involves things like, why don't you guys hang out and read books like comics? Or why don't you work together and do illustration, use illustration as a way to design protest signs, to communicate with others about the concerns. And some of the initiatives I plan to work on is to create a series of kind of one-sheet comics that explain what a library is, how it operates, the library ecosystem, and finding ways to kind of help people understand how libraries are at risk right now through censorship, and how libraries aren't just places where books exist, but they are community centers, and comics are an important part of that community center, and they're the format that is in a lot of places the most at risk because it has images, and you've got states like Missouri that specifically target in their laws images that are sexually explicit. Missouri is not getting sued for that, but you need to talk about kind of the risks that comics specifically face, and you need to find ways to keep people engaged in this. And comics are a great creative way not just to engage within the group that you're protesting with, but also to engage people who don't know what's going on, and help inform them about what's going on.
Thank you. So I was thinking about this as we were talking, and I have been cosplaying since, I'll say, the late 90s, way before I even had a word for it. As a high school English teacher, I was that English teacher that abused every single spirit day, every dress-up opportunity, and I would completely leverage it for my community, for my curriculum. I was always the wild English teacher, like, have you seen Miss Taylor yet today? And if you're like, I'm not sure, then you didn't see me. And so I would say, again, what I said earlier is about being strategic and normalizing comics in your community. And so, as I said, as far back as when I was an English teacher, I would use those dress-up days, and depending upon where I wanted to go with it, I've developed the phrase, well, actually, my partner has developed the phrase sartorial outreach for me, because I use my fashion choices as a way to reach my community, and that opens the door to my elevator pitch. And I've been doing it from the late 90s. I moved into the library classroom. I work at the state library now. Almost every single conference that I attend professionally, I do a mild cosplay, because then I can reach out to the community.
Cosplay, I love that term.
So that I can reach that community there, and we can talk about how we can bring it back to our communities. I think about, Star Wars Day. I can't tell you how many times I have come dressed as Han Solo or Vader or something. My kids are like, what's all that about, miss? And then I would tell them about it. No, and by the way, can I show you our collection? Same thing, if we go to something out in the community, again, I always have, I'm accused of always librarianing, and that I'm always on message. And so thinking about, what do I hear people saying? Even just conversation around you. I'm a people watcher. So what do I hear people saying? What do I see them noticing? How have I attracted their attention? And I can use that as my foot in the door to talking to them. Same thing is true, not just with professionals and my colleagues, but also with community members, whether it's students, whether it's patrons at a library, because now I'm at the state library, so the entire state of Texas, scary as that is in theory my patron. And so how can I get those connections started? And I guess the last part I will say on this, I didn't have a good segue for it, but one thing I am so excited to see, for sure I can talk about Texas, but I'm certain it's happening in other states too. I've seen a lot more library cons cropping up and happening, and so thinking about how we can focus on comics, graphic novels, sequential art, pop culture, bringing that in and seeing those libraries connecting with their communities, and what can I do at the state level to help amplify that in terms of the context that I have. So.
Wonderful. So in terms of the question asking about leveraging community initiatives, again, I'm going to tailor this to like a school community. Something I've had in addition to my student caseload, I also run a comic book club for my 5th grade students. It's after school. Everyone's invited, students that are in the self-contained program, students that are in gen ed, every single student. If you are a Goodwin Eagle, you are welcome. And so what I've done is I've connected things with our Goodwin school rules. I've had them do different illustrations of that to teach the kindergartners, hey, you are brand new to the school, this is what it looks like. And with something like comics, something like sequential art, you are taking away the barrier of the decoding part of reading. They no longer need to know how to read in order to obtain the information from the comic. I mean, think of all the ways that we use that. I got on the airplane to come out here. I didn't need to read to know how to use the emergency stuff. I put together an IKEA bookshelf. I don't need to know how to read. Can you imagine if they had to describe that panel by panel? That would be an absolute nightmare. There are times where delivering the information with sequential art is not just okay to do, but it's to the advantage of the people that you're communicating with. So I've had students that connect the school rules, the school values with that. I've also used it with some of my students who are non-speaking and many who are speaking in terms of communicating how they have worked through something difficult, social, emotionally, something they may not have the language for yet, either because they haven't wrapped their heads around it fully, or they just, vocabulary-wise, just aren't there yet. So for example, have you heard of people saying, oh, is this a big problem or a little problem? Have you used or heard of that? I think it's terrible, because it's really this like 3D chess, and maybe neurotypical people get it, I don't, of do I think the adult, do I the adult assign this a big value or a little value? Would I as an adult think it's a big deal or a little deal? And then the kid's like, well, I have big feelings about it, but I've been trained and I practiced that no, breaking my pencil isn't a little deal, isn't a big problem. But I have big feelings about it, and now I don't have a pencil, and I don't know where to, like, I use, is this a big problem, a little problem, not to shame a student into the right answer, but what tool do we need to get you through this? Because if this is a big problem, it doesn't matter what I think it is. The person I'm talking to, do you think it's a big problem? It's a big problem, we need a big tool. Let's go into our big toolbox for things. Big tool, we get to take a walk all the way around the school. If you're with an adult, you're good to go. Little problem, I might need to just, do my figure 8 on the desk, breathing in and breathing out. So it is not to using comics, using these written forms of communication that are graphic in nature and sequential, are to get rid of some of those barriers like decoding. English language learners that have no disability, just haven't been around English long enough to have it as fluently as their peers, they can use these, they can access this information without the gatekeeping that decoding offers.
Can I append my response just briefly? So I mentioned library cons in my response, and I totally forgot this until it was something you said that I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't mention that. When I was a campus librarian, my former co-librarian, fantastically zany person, convinced me that we should run a con out of our library. And so I am the co-founder of the Central Texas Teen and Kids Comic-Con that's held in Round Rock Independent School District, and I would be remiss if I had not mentioned that. I was going to catch it when I get home. But that was a huge way that we were able to connect with our community, is seeing that comics and graphic novels, sequential art fans were not seeing themselves, and our collection resonated with it, or education as a whole. And so it's grown to the point that it's pretty significant community event. I wasn't able to be there this past year, and I was very upset about that because it was coming back after the height of the pandemic. But last count I saw, we had at least 5,000 people coming to a high school campus from the area for a family-friendly, free, right? That's a different story. A family-friendly, free event.
That's huge.
I know. So excited.
That's an incredible event. Very cool.
Thank you.
Can I,
So I'm gonna go.
can I also add a little bit?
Yeah,
Okay.
please. Plus
So
one.
I want to talk a little bit, kind of like offer a little bit of historical perspective on the accessibility of comics. So comics, I mean, they started in the newspapers at the turn of the century. I should probably qualify the 20th century. And, it was, at the time, Hearst and Pulitzer were trying to sell newspapers. But it was intentionally, they were intentionally designed to be accessible to the hoi polloi, the people who didn't read as well, didn't want to subscribe to the Atlantic, which was snobby then too. And so comics have always been a format that is uniquely accessible, and a format that reaches audiences who don't necessarily have the same kind of facility to read prose or to read The Atlantic or whatnot. And there's a long history of using comics to address social ills and the things that plague communities. And so it's a sophisticated way to address these issues, and it's an unfortunately unappreciated sophistication in comics, because we still confront these issues with comics aren't reading, and comics aren't real literature, and they're not academically stringent enough. And so there have been entire publications focused on community ills that are in comics. You look at Resist, which was released in conjunction with the Women's March. The first Women's March, which is it's an anthology that Francois Smolly put together to celebrate women's voices and our concerns with society. And there's a history of publications like that to address societal ills.
That's fantastic. I like what you brought up about comics not being real reading and pushback and that kind of thing. And while it's true that it does have its advantages accessibility-wise in terms of not requiring that decoding piece, but it's also, you'll notice that the kids, or even adults, people who are newer to reading comics, they tend to bubble hop. So they just read dialogue and they don't take time to look at the art, but that's half the story. And so you'll have kids that just bubble hop, your students that have splinter skills for decoding but struggle a lot more with comprehension. They're just gonna bubble hop and they're not gonna get the full story. And some of the students who aren't as great at decoding, they're gonna get the other half of the story. And so I think that comics have this built-in differentiation tool where, yes, they can be differentiated to the point where it is more accessible to people that don't have as many skills, but it's also, to really get the full impact of a comic, it's also more challenging than prose in that you're going to have to make more meaning of some of the abstract components, either the emanata, like the light bulb above the head, or the 3 stars circle them when they hit their head, like those kind of internal state symbols. But in addition to that, with the body language and the facial expressions and things like that, you'll get to the end and they'll be like, oh, this is what happened. And then another kid will be like, well, he's definitely lying. Like, look at his face in that scene. And then now you have the development of oral language and oral vocabulary in that. And so they're able to make a deeper meaning. So while it can be differentiated down, if you want to say that, in terms of taking away that decoding benchmark, it can also be differentiated up in terms of snagging those students who are good at decoding but really aren't making the meaning by taking their time. We have one more planned question, and then we'll open to the floor to audience questions. And if no one raises their hand, I will call on you. So start formulating. All right, so finally, what title suggestions do you have for using comics to connect with your community?
Okay, well, there's so many titles. So I'm going to focus a little bit on kind of comics that facilitate civic engagement because that's my wheelhouse. Actually, I don't have a specific link. This would have been handy if we'd had a or a thing on the screen, whatever you call those. But CBLDF a couple years back published a list of kind of recommendations for civic.
And can you tell us what CBLDF stands for and maybe say it slower?
The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is comics' kind of First Amendment organization defending the First Amendment rights of the community. And a few years back, they published a list of kind of comics on civic engagement, and prominent among those are books like Nate Powell. Actually, is somebody I recommend a lot. In part because Nate was the illustrator on the March trilogy and the subsequent publications. But Nate has a long history of working on comics that address underrepresented communities and American history, which is also under attack in all the censorship. And he also released a book a few years back about his experience taking his daughters to protests and engaging in kind of civil discourse and civil disobedience, good trouble. And so I tend to kind of like refer to Nate Powell often because he's someone in a lot of regards who's learned to use his privilege as a way to address the things that impact our community. And so if you want a link to that CBLDF article, come talk to me after the panel and I can give you a URL.
So true to form, I'm going to teach you to fish rather than just giving you a list of titles. Largely because one of the main things is going back to that first idea that I had as far as being strategic, is that the titles that are going to work best for your purposes are going to be the ones that meet your community's needs, that are going to resonate with them. So I'm going to give you a list of a couple places that I tend to go look when I am looking for what I want to use as part of my programming or my teaching. So the first one, and Texas proud, I will go ahead and put that one out there. Maybe I shouldn't phrase it like that. Let me rethink that one. But I am from Texas, born and raised there. And so I have been a part of a graphic novel reading list that's put out by the Texas Library Association. I guess I got nervous and forgot. There is a graphic novel reading list. There are two, actually, that cover the K-12 curriculum. And so the one that goes kindergarten through elementary, kindergarten through 5th grade, is called the Little Mavericks. And their sister organization, which covers 6th grade through 12th through secondary, is called the Maverick List. And these reading lists are populated by degreed librarians in both school library as well as public library, and they read extensively outside of their own genres, outside of their own personal interests, looking for comics, graphic novels, graphic literature, that sort of thing, that has been published in the last 2 years and that they deem worthy of merit and should be included in collections. And so whenever someone asks me what I recommend, first thing I do is I recommend for them to go there. I do know that there are other entities that also have award lists, but check out your award list. Somebody has reviewed those things and has said, there's a lot of good stuff happening here. Bearing that in mind, my other recommendation is a set of databases that is created and maintained by cartoonist Mari Naomi? Okay,
It's
Naomi.
Mary Naomi.
Mary Naomi, thank you. I knew I was not pronouncing that
Oh,
correctly.
sorry, Mari.
Mari?
Naomi. Mari Naomi, there it is.
Okay, Mari Naomi. There are 3 databases. There is Cartoonists of Color, there is Queer Cartoonists, and the Disabled Cartoonists. And so I think between awards lists, some other selection aids, those databases, you can find the content that is going to connect with your community and those goals that you've set for building those connections.
Wonderful. Well, I will definitely defer to the librarians in terms of coming up with book lists, but I do want to say I have had incredible success with Calvin and Hobbes. Every kid still reads they know Calvin and Hobbes, they know which one is which, like they know those, the old ones that they still read Peanuts, they still read Garfield. I got into it with a kid about Jim Davis the other day because he was telling me that Jim Davis had drawn all the speech bubbles wrong, and I said, what? And he said, because there's the little circles and then the cloud next to Garfield, and that he's not thinking, he's talking. I'm like, well, how do you know that he's talking and not thinking all that stuff? And he's like, huh. And then I'm reading through, I'm like, well, could he be thinking those things? And then we talked it through, and he's like, well, how would you know if it was thinking versus talking or talking? And he's like, well, I would know it's talking if the other person responded in a way that meant they had, and I just watched him kind of reason through that, and he came to the conclusion maybe Jim Davis did know what he was talking about and could draw a comic or two. But I kind of let him process, just, Socratic method, just asking him questions. Oh, why do you think so? And he got there on his own. So really those older ones that have been classic are classic for a reason, because they're very simple and straightforward. They have recognizable characters, and they're still funny. They're still so funny. And so I think that it's a very low stakes. You don't have to, if you want to hop into Marvel nowadays, you have to read, 3 years worth of something, and someone will still tell you it's wrong, and it got retconned because this guy, and he got fired, whatever. You can hop into Calvin and Hobbes any day, and you are caught up within a panel. You know exactly what the story is, these characters, and they're consistent over time. So I think that using just those classic comic newspaper strips are phenomenal.
But during the course of your response, I started to become very attached to the idea that Garfield might be an empath. He might, or a telepath, also empath. So,
Ooh, so
think
what
on that
symbol
one.
would you use? Because you can use thinking or
How do we know?
Emanata from the
yeah, emanata, yeah.
There you
shape. That's
I've got some.
fantastic. Is there anybody that has questions about reaching out with their community, about comics in general, librarianship, legal defenses? I will call on you. That's fine.
On the guy in the front row with the awesome green sweater. Or
That's the
vest.
best. Is there anyone who has a birthday in January? Somebody just got looked. Oh, I see a hand. Yes. For January? All right, ask us a question.
Okay, so no problem.
You can move up.
So you wanted the names of, or the name of the cartoonist that maintains those 3 databases? Is that what I understand? Oh, fantastic. Betsy's got
It's
spells for you.
it's MARNAOMI.
Yeah.
M-A-R-I.
It's MARI. Sorry.
And
I might have
Gosh,
it.
oh. MARINAOMI.
oh,
Didn't do very well in spelling bee.
that
so.
reminded me, there's another list. It's called A Novel Mind, anovelmind.com, put together by Sally Pla. She's actually a local author. She wrote The Someday Birds, Stanley Will Probably Be Fine, and just a brand new book, The Fire, the Water, and Maudie McGinn, which came right before I came on the trip, so the book came with me. So excited. But she put together a list of books in which neurodivergent lead characters. So autistic people, ADHD, bipolar, OCD, and so also creators that create whether or not the lead is, or main characters are neurodivergent, but the representation is there for all kinds of minds.
I just want to add, it's not exclusive to comics, but We Need Diverse Books is a really good resource.
Yes.
And I would also suggest social media. I know social media is a little bit of a
Blessing and a curse.
mostly a curse these days. But especially, there are a lot of book talkers in particular who talk about diverse titles and ways to engage diverse communities. And so it's definitely a good resource. And if you find one that you like, odds are you can take that as kind of like a hub to a bunch of others that can lead you to titles and ideas for engaging your community.
Fantastic. Birthday in January, do you have a question?
Question.
Okay.
Just, like, if you could give us any like resources or any ideas that you've had for, because you talked about like the library comps and the staff and my supervisors and directors have discussed wanting to do that in our area. So we are a very small area population of like 20,000.
Okay.
So nothing to the size of maybe Texas. If you have any like ideas that we could use, that would be great.
I completely do. That is a separate panel that I have done before, but I do have the notes from it. So before we leave, make sure you connect with me and I will give you my business card. But I've done a couple of different panels with my former co-librarian about how we hosted a con and what we did. And she wrote, as we were through the process, and has tweaked it since then and given me permission to share, a step-by-step list that talks about a year out, or timeline from about a year out, the kind of things you want to start doing. So I can definitely give you that information. I also have recorded at least one panel where I did that with another one. So, yes.
I just want to add, CBLDF has a publication, although it's been a couple years since they've updated it. They have basically a Banned Books Week handbook of their own, and they talk about comics programming during Banned Books Week. And Banned Books Week might happen once a year, but books are being banned all the time, and these are programming ideas that you can use year-round. Kind of like we're talking about, like baking comics into kind of the everyday experience. It's also, important to also bake in conversations about censorship and intellectual freedom. And so I would definitely check out the website for that. If you can't find it, drop me a line. It's kind of hard to find right now. And then a plug for the Banned Books Week Coalition. We have a resources section on that website. There are present, I think we just added our 21st organization to the fold for the Banned Books Week Coalition. And in the resources, it's a clearinghouse of basically all of the intellectual freedom and programming ideas for Banned Books Week, and these are things that can be used beyond Banned Books Week.
Wonderful. Any other questions? Good.
I have a two-part question. The first part is of your education, the educational comic books. Have those been useful for those for a special education, those with disabilities? Have you done anything towards that area?
There have been. So in terms of educational comics, I'm interpreting that as something like, hey, you should learn about this topic, and it kind of goes over that thing. There are science comics that are really great. There's like everything from the science of sharks and dogs to how to fix a car, how to plant a garden, like things that lend themselves very much to sequential art as being the way to communicate that content. But in terms of also the it sounded like you were talking a little bit about students who like are seeing themselves represented, working through difficult. Yeah. So there is a series called Jake Jet Pulse. A man named Led Bradshaw and his son Jake, who's autistic, has done about him being a superhero, and so his dad draws it, but he has a lot of say, or they collaborate in creating it. So having that could be. It's not as explicit as like the, how to fix a car, how to garden. It's not here's how to be autistic. But I think that watching being represented and navigating regular or high stakes situations with that neurodiversity in mind, with a disability in mind, and being less explicitly, here's how you should deal with it, because there's something called social stories, which is often used with students who experience anxiety. Sometimes it's misused because it tells them like that it's a big problem, now it tells you what you're allowed to do, and a social story as it was originally intended is here's what's going to happen so you can feel less anxious about it, here are some options, as opposed to more of a prescribed this is what should happen. So I think that with students co-creating something, and they do have a lot of forgiveness for your art skills if you're an educator yourself. So really just a stick figure with a couple of exaggerated features. Usually they'll throw shade and absolutely never let you live it down because, oh boy. Co-creating something with them might be a way to go in terms of having them feel the agency. But like I said, I have the Jake Jet pulse off the top of my head. But I think, since you mentioned being an educator, if you created something with them, I think that could help them navigate whatever it is they're struggling with. Thank you.
I also want to recommend graphic medicine. Within the comics literacy community, I've seen a rise on something that's being termed graphic medicine. And it's very much an expansive, a very inclusive view of medicine, talking about all of the different ways that we as people need.
It's kind of like comics meets infographics.
Yes, it's like comics
It's a
meets
really
infographics.
accessible way to communicate really intense, in-depth information in the medical realm.
Yes, and sometimes that is the root of why people are feeling disenfranchised in their own communities. And so that's a good way to possibly make a connection there.
I think you said it was a multiple-part question. I don't want to cut you off.
Oh, sorry.
Also another one, has any one of the writers or artists that have done comic books for those that are epileptic?
I haven't heard of any off the top of my head.
Let me Google this real quick.
Right.
Right.
I haven't heard anything either.
What a librarian. I don't have the information, but I can get it to you in 2 to 3 minutes. No, but that would be a really important one.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, as you can see, there are a lot of gaps in kind of the communities that that need to be served. We're still filling in those gaps. It's improving. We've got, I mentioned earlier, there's more women creating comics now. We've got more of these underrepresented groups creating comics, and it's essential that they have the capacity to do so, which is part of the reason censorship is a threat, because it's making it more difficult for these for these communities to create.
Ooh, I did want to throw in Sensory Life on the Spectrum is a anthology. I kickstarted it a couple years ago, and then it became more wide release. But it's of all autistic creators, and then they're just 2 or 3 page short stories within that. Some of them very explicitly saying, this is my experience with autism, and some of them just, slice of life.
So I did actually find a comic book called Epileptic from Europe. That's it was published in 2005. It looks like it might be out of print, but you can probably find copies of it online or in used bookstores. So, and it came out from Pantheon.
Excellent. Any other questions? Gentleman in the front row.
That we do not know at all.
Yes.
This was for Jana. Have you found, you mentioned both wordless comics as
Mhm.
representation for these ways of communicating information, and also your students who do not speak or only occasionally speak. Is there a relationship between those two? Do they identify strongly with works like Owly or like Marvel's Flight series?
So again, my N is 45, so extrapolate from that what you will. But they, like most other speaking students that, don't have any identified disabilities, they go for the pop culture stuff, they go to that kind of thing. I think that they do enjoy that. Like I mentioned the story about connecting because my talker was the same color, so I think sometimes when those kind of things happen, they can see a little bit more of themselves in that, and possibly as they get older and more reflective, but I haven't, again, my N of 45 really noticed that they're particularly drawn to those, but I do think that they are more so drawn to that than my speaking students, if that makes sense. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? They haven't flashed a sign at me recently, so I think we got some wiggle room. February birthdays.
Oh, I have another recommendation, actually.
Okay.
Because I'm totally obsessed with civic engagement. First Second did a series a few years back called World Citizen Comics about kind of the U.S. government, the Constitution, the First Amendment, and I think it's a really great series to kind of as a fundamental examination of how the government's supposed to operate in a perfect world. Obviously, we don't. It's not perfect, but I'd want to recommend those. And also, the graphic novel adaptation of Stamped by Ibram X. Kendi is amazing. It's so good.
What's the name of the series with Unrigged? And it's Unrigged. It talks about like the history of gerrymandering and disenfranchising and stuff. And I had lent it to my mom, and she said, and she gave it back dented. She said she kept throwing it because she was so mad. Like, it's just one of those kind of things, you know, they never taught us in school. Unrigged is one of them. What's the name of that? Yeah, that's it. No,
Yeah, it's
but it's part of a series.
yeah, it's the world. It's the world.
Yeah, World Citizen Council.
Comics. Yeah.
Okay, World Citizen Comics. So in terms of engagement, there's that one, and there was another one I read recently.
I think there's 6 or 7 books in the
Yeah,
series.
the one I read was purple. Sorry, librarians that just had like don't tell me the
What
color of it.
unites
That
us?
doesn't help.
What unites us?
What unites us?
Yeah.
Yep, that's the purple one.
And I had put that series in my high school library collection, so. Oh, question over there.
So I work in a civic engagement, community engagement center at a university, and continue to think about how do we get our students to wrap around and think about community engagement, civic engagement. They're very much focused. It's very academically rigorous, but like they're very focused on anything that just has to do with their faculty and what's happening in the classroom. And so getting them to think broader beyond that has been one of my challenges, but also one of the challenges. So I'm wondering, like, are there particular kinds of recommendations you might have that might be for like college students, or even just something to get them really thinking about like civic community engagement that sometimes can be beyond that piece that you were talking about around like just speaking about like physical like marching protest. Because I'm trying to get them to think about, you know, how do they do this work as citizens systemically.
Does your faculty recognize that there's often a civic engagement component to the curriculum that they are teaching?
It's a hit or miss. Like, we have a whole office that does community engaged scholarship. But that's not my office in practice.
Right.
It's kind of like a partnership. But I will say that I think a lot of our faculty are the kind of faculty that are like, this is my research and I'm focusing externally in my field.
Okay.
Versus a campus.
I just asked from an educator perspective that you might come at it from a different angle rather than necessarily just what you put in front of the students, but also getting the faculty to recognize that. I've been in that situation on a high school level and just making those connections, and especially with maybe even the most resistant faculty members, getting them to recognize there's this component to what you're doing. Even if you were just talking about which topics, which titles are privileged when you teach your curriculum, that's reflective of some value. And looking at civic engagement from that perspective, and if you can win over the faculty, then many times they will start putting those books in front of their students, in front of the people that they are teaching, and they will work with you as far as collaborating and teaching and what needs to be in the collection to support their curriculum. I think in an academic environment, like I said, I was coming from a high school, but in an academic environment, having the buy-in of the faculty and recognizing how you are there as a curriculum partner to support what they're doing makes a huge difference.
I think what you're also confronting is there's been kind of a general erosion of civic education in the lower grades, and so you're having to overcome that particular obstacle as well. I think the World Citizen comics are actually a really good resource even at the college level. It does skew older than most of First Seconds books. Pretty high-level concepts when it comes to talking about government. I would also suggest things like, is it Strike, the Cesar Chavez book? I was trying to remember the name of it. I've got a picture of it here, but I don't see the name of it.
I think it is Strike.
And things like Stamped. You know, I know you're talking, you want to go beyond just like protests, but if you look at the success of these protests, why Cesar Chavez worked, it was a multidimensional, multifaceted movement. It wasn't just showing up and protesting. It was having politicians on your side. It was letter writing. It was a diverse engagement with the kind of the civics around it, so that, you know, you turn the conversation into, it's not just about protest, what else were they doing to facilitate change?
Thank you. Like we said at the beginning, we could talk about these topics all day. They're worth several panels and days and perhaps library cons of content, but we are getting the signal to wrap it up. Thank you all so much for joining us. Please connect with us afterwards.
We did it.